For most, the day of death is unknown, while for a few they even know the exact time. The period before a condemned prisoner's execution is called the death watch. It's a time of isolation and waiting as the prisoner counts the final hours of their life. What goes through their mind in these final moments? In this video, we will explore the last hours of those condemned to execution on their final day on Earth. Teddy was a notorious serial killer and body violator, considered one of the most infamous criminals of the 20th century. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy devoted himself to abusing and taking the lives of several women in different places, such as Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida. In 1979 and 1980, Bundy faced 2 trials in which he represented himself, as he had attended law school for a few years and knew how to behave in court. He always appeared calm, confident, and unconcerned during questioning. However, the evidence presented against him was irrefutable, and by the end of 1979, he had been sentenced to death on 2 occasions. But this was not the end for Teddy Bundy. In 1980, he faced another trial for the murder of Kimberly Lyric, a 12-year-old girl who was his last victim in Florida. There, he was sentenced to death by electrocution for the 3rd time. He spent nearly a decade awaiting his execution at Florida State Prison, also known as Stark Prison. As is common with those sentenced to death, Bundy attempted to appeal his sentence multiple times. While continuing his appeals, he began granting interviews. In these interviews, Teddy talked about his crimes and mental process, though he made sure to speak in the 3rd person. He discussed his career as a thief and confessed that most of his valuable possessions were stolen. He reveled in the fact that if he wanted something, he would just go out and take it without paying. It is very likely that this mindset influenced his decision to brutally assault and murder his victims. When his execution date was set for July 2, 1986, Bundy decided it was time to make a confession. He confessed to 2 investigators that he had taken the lives of 30 women. Although some people believe he is responsible for harming more than 100 women, he explained how he would return to the locations where he had harmed his victims and perform unacceptable sexual acts with their decomposing bodies, continuing this behavior for several days until he could no longer do so. As shocking as it may seem, this was not the only reprehensible practice he engaged in. Bundy also confessed that he used to decapitate some of his victims with a hacksaw and take the heads home as a sort of trophy. After several delays, Bundy's execution date was set for January 24, 1989. For his last meal, he made no special requests and was given the standard prison meal, which consisted of meat, eggs, fried potatoes, and toast. However, he lost his appetite and couldn't touch the food. On his last night alive, hundreds of people camped outside the prison, celebrating and anticipating his death. Inside the prison, Bundy accepted his fate and made 2 final phone calls to say goodbye to his mother. The notorious offender's final words were, "I'd like to send my love to my family and friends." He was executed by electrocution at 7:40 a.m., with witnesses present to observe the event. After confirmation of his execution, those waiting outside the prison set off fireworks and celebrated Teddy Bundy's death. After Bundy's execution, his body was transferred to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. His brain was removed and given to scientists for examination in an effort to find any anomalies that might have contributed to his heinous acts. Finally, Bundy's body was cremated as per his wishes, and the ashes were scattered in the Washington mountains, the same place where he had hidden the bodies of some of his victims. John Gacy's childhood was problematic, as his relationship with his father was strained. His father, who was an alcoholic, often hurt him physically and emotionally, as well as his sisters and mother. Growing up, Gacy may have struggled to understand his sexuality, as he was attracted to men but lived in a largely homophobic society. Faced with this challenge, Gacy decided to get married. He then moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where his wife's family owned 3 restaurants, and he became a manager. John's life seemed perfect until May 1968, when he was accused of sexually assaulting 2 boys. This was the beginning of Gacy's dark path, a path that would eventually lead to his premature end. In November of that same year, he pleaded guilty to a sodomy charge and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. During this period, his wife divorced him and fled with their children. While in prison, John became a model inmate, and after serving 18 months of his sentence, he was released on parole in June 1970. Once out of prison, Gacy returned to his birthplace of Chicago to restart his life. He was successful in reintegrating into society. He founded a successful business, got married, attended church, and was known for hosting elaborate parties. However, a dark side remained within him, waiting to be unleashed. The sudden disappearance of a boy named Robert in December 1978 led to an investigation that resulted in John Gacy's arrest. It was discovered that Gacy had been luring young men to his home, where he would abuse them and subsequently take their lives. Gacy was finally arrested on December 22, 1978, after which he confessed to the murders of around 30 or more young men. After hearing the confession, the police searched his house and found 26 bodies hidden in a crawl space beneath the home. John's trial began in February 1980, and he was charged with 33 murders. He was found guilty of murder as well as sexual assault and was sentenced to death. John spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center. The isolation that comes with being on death row led him to begin painting. He often painted clowns, skulls, his house, and birds. His paintings were even displayed and sold at auctions. As interesting as this may seem, it wasn't the only thing Gacy became interested in. He read a wide variety of legal books and accumulated the knowledge necessary to file several appeals. However, his knowledge and appeals were not enough to save him, as in October 1993 the execution date was set for May 10th of the following year. The day before his execution, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center, where the execution would take place. Gacy spent the afternoon with his family at a picnic held on prison grounds, which would be his last meal. Gacy requested a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. In the evening, he was visited by a Catholic priest who performed the last rites before Gacy was led to the execution chamber. As Gacy mentally prepared himself to lose his life, a crowd gathered outside Stateville Correctional Center awaiting his execution. Most of them were happy that Gacy's reign of evil was coming to an end. After being strapped to the execution chair, Gacy's alleged last words were, "Kiss my ass." The attending lawyer argued that he was speaking to a prison officer. Gacy was finally executed by lethal injection, and his body was later cremated. Aileen Wuornos was born to an underage mother who abandoned her with her grandparents when she was just 11 years old. At that age, Aileen was already selling her body at school in exchange for drugs, food, and cigarettes. From then on, she decided to make this her career before eventually becoming a serial killer. Aileen had an extensive criminal history and was arrested multiple times for various reasons, including theft, between the ages of 14 and 22. Aileen witnessed the worst that the world had to offer, and because of this she attempted to take her own life 6 times, though none were successful. While working as a prostitute, Aileen developed a thirst for blood and unleashed it between 1989 and 1990. She took the lives of 7 men, aged between 40 and 65, and became known as the Lady of the Night. Aileen was eventually arrested in Florida and charged with the murder of 6 men. During the trial, Wuornos claimed that the killings were committed in self-defense because she was being assaulted by the men. Although she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, Aileen was not acquitted. The prosecution argued that she committed the crimes for financial gain. By February 1993, Aileen had been sentenced to death 6 times for all the lives she had taken, except 1. From the moment of her arrest until her execution, Aileen spent 12 years on death row. Her time there was marked by highs and lows as she began making strange allegations. In 2002, she accused prison guards of adding saliva, urine, and dirt to her food. She claimed that the prison staff was trying to frustrate her to the point where she would take her own life before the execution. Ultimately, Aileen complained about a long list of things, including low water pressure, mold on her mattress, tight handcuffs, and many other grievances. These constant complaints about her living conditions may have been an attempt to have her sentence overturned or to receive a pardon, but whatever the case, that tactic never worked. In the weeks leading up to her execution, Aileen gave interviews in which she stated that her mind was tormented. She also spoke about how she felt regarding the way she was being portrayed in the media. Aileen felt she was being unfairly depicted as a monster and was represented as a ruthless tyrant with no regard for human life. Aileen was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. For her last meal, she requested nothing but a cup of coffee. Her final words were, "Yes, I would just like to say that I'm sailing with Day Rock and I will come back like on Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like in the mothership from the movie Big Mother. And I will come back, I will come back." Aileen was the second woman to be executed in Florida since the reintroduction of the death penalty in 1976. After her execution, her body was cremated, and her ashes were given to her childhood friend Dawn Botkins, who maintained her friendship with Aileen despite her crimes. Botkins took the ashes to Michigan and scattered them under a tree. While she was alive, Aileen loved to listen to the album Tiger Lily by Natalie Merchant and requested that a song from the album be played at her funeral, a request that was eventually honored. Barbara Graham, at 22 years old, was already working as a prostitute, where she became involved in gambling and the use of illegal substances. She befriended known criminals who introduced her to all kinds of criminal activities. After 3 failed marriages in the past, Barbara married Henry Graham in 1953. He worked as a bartender, but was a low-level addicted criminal. Barbara soon befriended her husband's friends, who were also criminals, and before long she began associating with people like Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins. Barbara's friendship with Jack Santo and Perkins would later lead her to commit her worst crimes and eventual demise. As their friendship blossomed, Barbara began an affair with Perkins, who told her about his plans to rob an elderly woman who supposedly kept large sums of money and expensive jewelry in her home. When the plan was set, Barbara, Santo, Perkins, and 2 other accomplices went to the woman's house, ransacked everything, and brutally hurt her to the point of taking her life. Despite their best efforts, the robbery was unsuccessful as they found no money. However, they committed a serious crime that led the police directly to them. During the trial, Barbara maintained her innocence, but the evidence presented against her, including witness testimonies and physical evidence, led to her conviction. In the court of public opinion, she was nicknamed Bloody Babs due to the severity of the murder and her lack of remorse. In 1955, Barbara, Santo, and Perkins were eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Barbara attempted to appeal her sentence, but all her appeals failed, and her execution date was set for June 3, 1955. The day before her scheduled execution, Barbara was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where the execution would take place. During most of her time there, she felt restless, pacing back and forth in the waiting cell for the execution chamber. It was a small cell and she could only take 4 steps between the wall and the door. She later received a visit from the prison warden, who sat down with her and spoke to her calmly. It seemed he knew she was terrified and was determined to help her calm down. Before leaving the cell, the warden ordered the prison guards to serve Barbara as many double chocolate milkshakes as she wanted. According to reports, Barbara consumed only milkshakes on the night before her execution. On the morning of June 3rd, Barbara had breakfast, which consisted of a hot fudge sundae. She was terrified of the execution and was known to openly express her disbelief about the situation. Her execution in the gas chamber was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but it was delayed until 11:30. Barbara requested that a cloth be placed over her eyes so she wouldn't see the faces of the officers. Her last words were, "Good people are always so sure they are right." When asked to take a deep breath to facilitate the process, she replied, "How do you know that?" which became her final words. Barbara's execution was witnessed by 30 people, including reporters and prison guards. Her husband Henry took care of Barbara's body, which was buried at California Cemetery after the execution.